Welcome back to Hardball. The biggest question of the last decade is how our country was led into invading Iraq based on a Bush administration fact that turned out not to be a true fact, that Iraq had or was on the verge of having nuclear weapons. In July of 2003, just after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, former Ambassador Joe Wilson wrote an article in the New York Times that said that he had personally traveled to Africa to check out a concern by Vice President Cheney in 2002 that Iraq had tried to buy nuclear materials from Africa. Wilson said that he could find no hard evidence that Iraq had tried to buy the nuclear materials, but that Cheney and President Bush had ignored his report and continued to use the claim of an Iraq deal with Africa as a key justification for war with Iraq. The way in which Cheney's office reacted to Wilson's charge remains under what the U.S. Special Prosecutor calls a cloud of dust thrown in the air by Cheney's Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, who was convicted on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. After all these months, we now have Vice President Cheney's testimony in the Libby case and have a chance to see it in a greater light. Newsweek investigative reporter and MSNBC contributor Michael Isikoff wrote about Cheney's interview with the FBI in his new blog, Declassified. And David Korn is the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones magazine, which also dissected Cheney's interview. Michael, I want you to tell us where you can find cases where what Cheney told the FBI doesn't square with what his chief of staff told the FBI under oath, or rather told the court in public testimony.
Well, in terms of contradictions, the most glaring one is whether or not Cheney had shared the information that Joe Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame Wilson, worked at the CIA with Scooter Libby. It was the outing of Valerie Plame Wilson that prompted the whole criminal investigation in the first place. And in the trial of Scooter Libby, one of the key pieces of evidence were Libby's own notes showing that he first learned about Valerie Plame Wilson working at the CIA from Dick Cheney himself after he had a conversation with then CIA Director George Tenet. In this FBI interview, Cheney says he doesn't recall ever sharing that information with Scooter Libby. It's one of, I think the AP calculated 71 instances where he said he didn't recall during the interview. So in terms of the substance, that's probably the one contradiction that leaps out the most. But I think the more interesting part of the whole interview is just the sort of raw look at Dick Cheney, the irascible, uncooperative witness who has disdain for the CIA. He talks about them as amateur hour and talks about their incompetence, disdain for the press, disdain even for the investigators themselves. And towards the end of the interview, he's complaining he's pressed for time to sort of say, I don't even have time for you guys. I don't have to be sitting here listening to these questions. I think that's the most interesting part of the interview.
David Korn, what blows my mind on this is the loyalty of Scooter Libby, who took the fall, as they used to say in the old mystery stories. He took the fall. He basically went down on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice for saying that he got the information from somebody in the media, for saying the vice president had nothing to do with this. The vice president said he had nothing to do with this over and over again. In fact, he said, I don't remember. In other words, all this was going on in the vice president's office, according to the trial. The vice president knew none of it, except to deny he had anything to do with outing Valerie Wilson. That's the only thing he said on the record. He couldn't remember anything else except that.
I think the interview transcripts show, too, that Dick Cheney probably was in the crosshairs of Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald for possible lying to the investigators. I mean, it wasn't a sworn statement, but if they still were investigators, because when he said, as Mike just laid out, that he didn't say that he just didn't recall what he told Libby or what he didn't tell Libby. He said he had no idea, that's his words, no idea how Scooter Libby learned that Valerie Wilson worked for the CIA, when in fact Libby's own notes show that Dick Cheney told him. And it's not just that they had one conversation about this in June 2003. Later, a few months later, in the fall of 2003, once the investigation is up and running, Scooter Libby starts going through his records, probably to see what evidence there is that he has to worry about, and he finds the note that shows that Dick Cheney told him. What does he do? He tells Dick Cheney about this note. So Dick Cheney was reminded by Scooter Libby in the middle of the investigation that you, Mr. Vice President, you told Scooter Libby, your chief of staff, about this key fact. And then several months later, when the FBI and Patrick Fitzgerald are asking Cheney questions about this, Cheney says he has no idea. I mean, this comes really close to perjury in spirit, if not in a legalistic manner. So Dick Cheney may be quite lucky that he's walking amongst the free today.
Well, interestingly enough, Michael Isikoff, you've covered this case and written about it in your great book. But, by the way, what's the name of your book?
You take it, Mike.
And there was a co-author there.
Okay.
Who's on the show tonight.
Hubris. Let me ask you about Dick Cheney. The fact that he was, at least on the record, trying to get a pardon in the end for his chief of staff. His chief of staff has lost his legal license. He's basically a felon on 5 counts of perjury and obstruction of justice. He'll never be able to work in a white shoe law firm again. He'll never be what he was before, a wise man at the highest level of foreign policy. And yet they go out and give them awards the other day. Frank, the other day, they're giving them these awards for what? For putting service above self, for basically covering up. For service above self. It's the most outrageous thing. The guy gets a trophy instead of a law license and his good name, and the vice president walks away with a smile and another trophy. This is like the little leagues where even the losers get trophies. You're laughing, but it's not funny if you're Scooter Libby.
If it's service before self, I guess the service was to Dick Cheney.
Yes, that's what I mean.
If you believe that Scooter Libby fell on his sword to protect his boss, the vice president, then that would certainly fit with the theme of that award there, which is self-sacrifice. Because, I mean, look, as we just pointed out, if the original information to the White House about Valerie Plame Wilson and her employment at the CIA came from Dick Cheney, then that put him at the very center of the whole investigation. And that was something that Scooter Libby had to deny. He couldn't deny it because it was in his notes. He had to insist implausibly that he forgot it and then only learned it later from Tim Russert, which, of course, the jury
did not believe.
Not plausible.
David Corn, are we going to have to wait for one of these rosebud moments or I believed moments from Bill Casey kind of thing where somebody in that end of their life finally says what happened here? I don't know. I've never seen a more complete case or where we just don't get the information that the public would like to know. How did we get into that war in Iraq based on a bogus case that there was an Iranian deal to buy, or an Iraqi deal to buy yellow cake from Niger? And how in the world did the vice president get away with simply being called a cloud of dust instead of having to face the music?
Patrick Fitzgerald ended the trial by saying there's a cloud over the vice president because Scooter Libby covered up and did not tell the truth. And to this date, because Patrick Fitzgerald, his job was to prosecute a crime, not to produce a public report to give us all the details, there are still lots of questions. We still don't know a lot about Karl Rove, who was one of the initial leakers, and what did he tell the president? The White House lied to the public when it said that Karl Rove was not involved, when in fact he was involved. And today he does quite well as a talking head on yet another network, and having once had a column for Mike's own news magazine. Scott McClellan, who was a low-level figure, did his tell-all. But the question is whether the neocons and others, who are a very tight-knit bunch, as you just saw from that award ceremony. Doug Feith was there as well. Don't forget him. Whether any of these guys end up dropping a dime on the whole gang at some point, I'm not sure I'd bet on that, Chris. We may be waiting a long time.
Well, I just think, meanwhile, Cheney has developed a dynasty. He's got a dynasty of family members out there selling the case. Right. It seems like it's going to go on forever. He's become the Pearl Mesta of Washington. He's out there holding salons and soirees. It never ends, except we never get the truth. Let me ask you, what's the value to historians and to journalists of finally this weekend, at the end of last week, finally getting this transcript, except to see that there's a conflict between what Cheney said on the record now with what his chief of staff said with regard to how he got the information about the CIA identity of Valerie Wilson. Your thoughts, Michael, first.
Yeah, well, like I said, I thought it was a very revealing look at Dick Cheney behind closed doors, how he operates, how he thinks, how he treats people, what he thought of people, his views of the CIA. Probably everybody was fixated at the time on the criminal case there about the outing of Valerie Plame Wilson. But the real larger political crime, as I think David and I wrote in Hubris, was the distortions and manipulations of intelligence.